Welcome back to the final part of the 2023 CanQuest. This time I'll finally be divulging my thoughts on every single film that played in competition this year. Since there's a lot to get through, I'll be keeping my thoughts on these films as brief as I can, but my full thoughts, as always, are in the Letterboxd reviews link down below. So without further ado, let's get going. First up is Asteroid City, directed by Wes Anderson. Now, by the time this video drops, the film will probably have been out for a bit, and you'll have formed your own takes on it, but for my money, this was easily Anderson's best since the Grand Budapest Hotel, and his most personal since his Royal Tenenbaum days. This is probably the best balance of the formal mastery of his late career with the more intimate storytelling of his earlier career, even though the framing device and cast of this film point to a much more ambitious scale. Asteroid City, for all its visual charm, comes across as something very personal to the director, as a meditation on emotional stasis and grief that almost surpasses every other attempt he's made on the subject. 8.5 out of 10. Next is Nanni Moretti's A Brighter Tomorrow. Even if I had more time, I wouldn't be able to muster up more than a few sentences for this. Moretti just feels like such an inessential filmmaker who's so convinced that he has something meaningful to say about life and the artistic process, but none of it comes across in this film. How he won the Palme d'Or for The Sun's Room will always be a mystery, and because of that, we're stuck with his mediocrity polluting the Cannes competition lineup until he retires. I don't know, he doesn't seem like a bad guy, but definitely a pompous one without the skill to back it up, and A Brighter Tomorrow pretty much cements that. This one gets a 5. Monster is the latest film from my GOAT, Hirokazu Kore-eda, and is also the first time since his debut that he didn't write one of his films himself. The film also won the Screenplay Award at the festival, and while I can see why the modest ambition of its structure got so much attention, I honestly feel like it was maybe a tiny bit much. The film is at its best in the last stretch when Kore-eda really lets his characters loose in a way that feels far closer to his loosely structured style, and until that point, the structural mismatch comes across as somewhat unnecessarily convoluted in moments. Still, the film is exceptionally acted as usual for the director's work, especially from these two kids, so there's really not much to complain about when they're really the backbone of the entire experience. Monster gets a light 8. Black Flies was easily the worst film to play in competition this year. Just endlessly bleak to an almost cartoonish degree. Ty Sheridan produced the film, and with that in mind, this really felt like a teen actor's attempt to break away from their childhood image into something raw and daring. But ultimately, Jean-Stéphane Sauvaire does extremely little with the material in his hands. The craft and the performances all feel urgent, but that doesn't translate into any sort of emotional impact. Sean Penn continues to be the kiss of death in Cannes, and Black Flies gets a 4 out of 10. Banel and Adama is the only directorial debut to play in competition this year, which already puts a lot of pressure on Ramata-Toulaye's shoulders. The reception of this one has been pretty mixed as a result, but I found the film to be extremely alluring. One thing you can't fault the film for is its gorgeous visuals. Every shot just feels like a crisp photograph come to life, and the airy, spiritual atmosphere works extremely well with this bare story to give Banel and Adama a poetic quality that's pretty par for the course for a lot of West African cinema. Maybe this more subdued style isn't something that most viewers are accustomed to, but as someone who really enjoys a lot of Senegalese films, I found C's efforts to be very, very worthwhile. 7.5 out of 10 for Banel and Adama. Perfect Days, the latest from legendary German director Wim Wenders, takes him to Japan with star Koji Yakusho cleaning public toilets. If that description alone didn't leave you scratching your head, then maybe you will when you hear that this was one of the best films of the whole fest. Just extremely effective in its simplicity, with Yakusho's restraint earning every bit of that Best Actor award. There's so much you can read on his face at every moment. Wenders' usual method of letting quiet emotions fold in on themselves to reveal whole new layers just works to perfection here. Not much else to add, but I think the film would be satisfied with this sort of brevity. Perfect Days gets an 8.5 out of 10. Firebrand is Karim Aïnouz's follow-up to his incredible Invisible Life of Eurydice Guzmão, and as a purported psychological horror movie about the last wife of Henry VIII, this will surely go down as the biggest disappointment of the year. Aïnouz, psychological horror period piece, Alicia Vikander, Jude Law as Henry VIII. There's absolutely no reason why this shouldn't have been a slam dunk. What it was instead was another standardized period piece with at least a modicum of flair. The only reason keeping this ahead of something like Jean Zuberi is that it felt like an actual director was behind it. But that director has proven that his vision is worth so much more, and what should have felt like a passion project just winds up feeling like a studio footnote. I was honestly expecting Firebrand to be a breakout film of the festival that would surprise a lot of people, but as it stands, the film gets a very, very light 6 out of 10 for effort. Up next is the newest film from Todd Haynes, May-December. This one is far campier than anyone was expecting, especially with such potentially dark subject matter. But Haynes really does manage to go all out in portraying just how silly everyone here is. Julianne Moore, Natalie Portman, and Charles Melton are all tapped into that perfect tonal balance that makes them all seem at once ridiculous and in some ways dangerous or even tragic. The film's premise almost invokes Bergman's persona, and if Bergman ever made a dark comedy inspired by 90s tabloid aesthetics, this would probably have been it. A difficult film to get your head around sometimes, tonally rather than narratively, but a satisfying experience all the same, and May-December gets an 8 out of 10. The Pot-au-Feu comes from Trần and Húng, most famous for his debut The Scent of Green Papaya. Like that film, his latest is very focused on the sensory power of cinema, just letting long scenes of characters cooking play out for all they're worth. The way this man shoots both food and the human body is just absolutely mouthwatering, and the tenderness of his storytelling just complements that style so effectively. The only award I correctly predicted was him winning Best Director, and I couldn't be happier with that prediction. Benoît Magimel and Juliette Binoche are obviously fantastic in the film, which is really saying something because a lot of times the camera's focus isn't even on them, but rather what their hands are doing with the food. You can really feel the experience of cooking seep through the screen. Aces all across the board for the Pot-au-Feu, 8.5 out of 10. Homecoming is the latest from Catherine Corsini, and that's about all I have to say about it. No, really, this movie just doesn't invite all that much discussion one way or the other. It's a serviceable story with decent characters and actors playing them, but absolutely nothing about Homecoming provokes much thought, and the supposed controversy around the film's production seems incredibly surprising given how much of a forgettable film it served. A decent effort, I guess, but seriously, I've hardly ever struggled this much to have anything to say about a movie. 5.5 out of 10? I guess? I don't know. Who cares? Youth, Spring is the latest documentary from famed Chinese filmmaker Wang Bing. It's over 3.5 hours long and is sure to divide people into two camps. Those completely engrossed by every minute, and those pissed off at the film for wasting their time. This time around, I fall much more into the latter camp, because while I do understand the intent behind the film's daunting runtime, again, I made an entire video about long films, nothing in this film's sluggish pacing and muted shooting style could convince me that this couldn't have been half the length and gotten across the exact same emotional experience. We learned very little about these characters beyond the basics, and for such an abusive length, that feels very much like a full-on waste of time. I really don't care if that was the point of the runtime, it was just unnecessary, full stop. Of all my takes, this one seems like the most controversial and willing to draw out assholes who comment that I have no attention span, which, if you're one of those people, trust me, doing that is about as useful as watching all 3.5 hours of this film. I'm glad if you felt that the 3.5 hours of textile working was worth what could have been expressed in at most 2 hours of textile working, but I personally just really couldn't get with it. 5 out of 10, and I want the youth that this film stole from me right back. The other documentary competing this year was Kaouther Ben Hania's 4 Daughters. This one was a lot better, and the way Ben Hania incorporates her documentary elements into the story makes for an emotionally resonant narrative. The only issue really is that the film takes so long to reveal why this setup was needed in the first place that, while the build-up does contextualize the eventual reveal, there just isn't as much time spent on the ramifications that come after the fact that would have made for an equally enticing angle on the story. Very acute and powerful storytelling, with some really interesting and tragic subjects at its center, but just slightly lacking in that extra factor to put it over the top. 4 Daughters gets a 7. Last Summer from Catherine Breillat is a remake of the Danish film Queen of Hearts from 2019. Did you see the Danish film Queen of Hearts from 2019? Good, then you saw Last Summer. Aside from where Breillat chooses to end the story, there's absolutely nothing her film has to offer that the original didn't, aside from decent performances, which the original also had. Much like Final Cut from last year, Last Summer isn't bad, but if you've seen the original, there's absolutely nothing this remake has to offer. And it seems like the only reason Breillat came out of retirement to direct this stale remake was because she's so inherently drawn to controversial subject matter, which was basically built into this premise from the jump. Last Summer gets a 6 out of 10. Kidnapped comes from Marco Bellocchio as yet another serviceable peek into Italy's tumultuous history. This time he tackles the church's overreach and how it played into eventual calls for secularization in Italy, and how this small story of a Jewish boy's kidnapping spirals into a much bigger national issue is probably the most engaging aspect of the film. Otherwise, while Bellocchio does occasionally flash some desire to be more stylistically daring, there's a scene with Jesus on the cross that's especially memorable, not much in Kidnapped escapes the comfort zone of a director content with just letting a story unfold as it is. And you know what? Sometimes that's just fine. So a solid 6 or 6.5 is more than fair, I think. Fallen Leaves is the latest from Finnish auteur Aki Kaurismäki. If you've ever seen one of his deadpan tragic comedies, then you know exactly what you'll get out of this one. It's short, it's sweet, it's well acted and charming enough, and it doesn't really have all that much that it wants to say beyond the importance of love between two people in a broken world. Actually, that may not be entirely fair because, especially today and with the film's contextualizing of the war in Ukraine, just how two people can find comfort in each other in a broken world is more than a worthwhile exploration to undertake right now. So Fallen Leaves earns a decent 7 out of 10. Jessica Hausner's newest Club Zero simply proves just how much of a continuous missed opportunity this director's entire filmography is. As with her last film, Little Joe, Hausner shows that she has an incredibly distinct and carefully calibrated style, and she just takes it absolutely nowhere. Other than Mia Wasikowska's performance, nothing in Club Zero exceeds surface-level satire, and unlike, say, Triangle of Sadness, the obviousness of its critique isn't offset by being actually funny or interesting. Hausner is just the master of taking interesting ideas and techniques and churning out complete nothingness, and now it's just getting frustrating. Club Zero gets a 4 out of 10. Speaking of disappointments, the next film on the docket is Ken Loach's final film, The Old Oak. Loach has been on an extremely uncommon hot streak for someone of his age, so when it was announced that his supposed final film, Sorry We Missed You, wouldn't actually be his final film, personally I was ecstatic. The Old Oak, by comparison with his last two features, is borderline saccharine, and given Loach's post-premiere remarks about hope in the face of right-wing hopelessness, I can understand why he wanted his career to end on less of a bitter note. But goddamn, it's just so disappointing to see one of my favorite directors redirect the end of his entire legacy with something so standard. The more I think about it, the more I think it's not Loach himself that's the problem with this film, but Paul Laverty's script. Everything Loach himself provides to the screen is pretty standard for what you'd expect, but it's Laverty's script that's surprisingly really kinda mawkish. It's very well put together, and Loach still gets some emotional performances out of non-professionals, as he usually does, but it really pains me to give Ken Loach anything close to a 6.5. But that's where we are. The last film I saw at the festival, but not the last one we'll discuss, was Alice Rohrwacher's La Chimera. After watching 3 films and 1 short, I've just concluded that nobody makes movies like this woman. Her style is just so singular and indescribable in its pull on magical realism and Italian grittiness that I really can't compare it to anything else. Her usual sense of wandering and grasping with Italian history is once again at the forefront, this time with a star who isn't even Italian. But Josh O'Connor is extremely well suited to this immediately defeated demeanor of a man just listlessly making his way through a barren existence. And Rohrwacher infuses her story with her unique charm that makes such a hopeless-sounding story more palatable than you'd expect. Definitely not for everyone, but a more than satisfying end to the festival for my money. La Chimera gets an 8 out of 10. Coming into the home stretch, the next film we're going to discuss is perhaps the most anticipated of the entire lineup, Jonathan Glazer's The Zone of Interest. If you know nothing about the film up to this point, keep it that way. This is a story best experienced with as little information as possible, because much of the horror at play comes from you slowly realizing what's actually happening. Even if you already know though, Glazer's distance vision is so compellingly muted that the terrors come through all the same. Interestingly, I disagree with some of the people who say that this film is impartial in its depiction of certain ideas, because some of the insert shots, the only close-ups we get in the film, can't help but conclude certain ideas about the film's subject matter. I am, of course, talking about cleaning the shoes and the items that the child is looking at under his flashlight. But the restraint of Glazer's vision tells you so much without telling you a damn thing. The Zone of Interest is the sort of film that provokes all the thoughts from your end, but never once does it feel like it's stretching for the audience to fill in substance that it doesn't have on its own. The Zone of Interest gets a very strong 9 out of 10. About Dry Grasses is the newest film from Can Darling and one of my absolute favorite directors, Nuri Bilge Ceylan. Like all of his films, this one is a muted rumination on life in rural Turkey, with extremely long and alluringly shot conversation scenes slowly revealing the ugliness of their characters. The particular narrative here, which only really comes into play about an hour in, is a pretty brave choice considering how reactionary the internet can be these days. But if you're willing to stick out the film's 3+ hour runtime, you'll find that all that time was well spent to flesh out some truly thought-provoking themes. Ahem. Ceylan's grasp of philosophy and human behavior is so transfixing even when you have trouble following along every single train of thought, and his actors are just so adept at chewing on this dense material. Ceylan even experiments with his style a bit here, chipping away at the stasis he's used to for a more occasionally chaotic vision that becomes completely enthralling. Altogether, a film like About Dry Grasses just reminds you of the value of slow cinema in its purest form, making for an instant 9 out of 10 viewing and easily the best film I saw in Cannes this year. Also, fun fact, I actually met the young actress in the film, Eche Bagsi, the day after the premiere when she sat next to me at my Zone of Interest screening. She's fantastic in the movie, and it was really nice to tell her that in person. She seems like a nice kid. I'm rooting for her future. And finally, this year's Cannes Quest will cap off with my thoughts on the Palme d'Or winner itself, Anatomy of a Fall. Prior to the festival, after viewing Justine Triet's previous film Sybil, a film that just felt like a lot of wasted potential, I had no real interest in seeing her follow-up. To my surprise, Triet's take on psychology has really been up this time around, culminating in a thrilling courtroom drama that, didn't really deserve the Palme, but was still incredibly engaging. Triet puts the entire institution of marriage on trial in this film, and thanks to an incredibly nuanced performance from Sandra Hüller, the answers to the questions themselves are only about half as interesting as whether or not the right questions are being asked in the first place. There is so much you can gather from every frazzled movement Hüller makes, and without her ambiguity, there's no way Anatomy of a Fall works at all. Triet's own vision is, in its best moments, controlled and, in its worst, surprisingly sloppy, but those moments of random zooms and shaky cam are few and far between. For the most part, Anatomy of a Fall is the sort of intellectual thriller we don't see much of in the mainstream these days, so it's nice to see the European art house bring that style back to a wider viewership. Anatomy of a Fall gets an 8 out of 10. So that concludes this year's Cannes Quest. Thank you all as always for watching, and if you haven't watched the previous videos, what are you waiting for? Subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and check out my full thoughts on these films on Letterboxd, linked in the description. Until next time, stay safe, and as always, I'll see you when I see you.